and it is my honor to welcome you all on behalf of the India International Center. We have gathered together here to listen to one of our eminent scholar from the Calcutta uh, Research Group, Dr. Samadar, Dr. Ranabir Samadar. He will be speaking on a topic which is extremely important and current, on epidemic migrant labor and the politics of life. Before I hand over to Dr. Samadar, it is my pleasure to introduce him, although I am sure most of you are familiar with him. Dr. Samadar is presently the Distinguished Chair in Migration and Forced Migration Studies at Calcutta Research Group. He was formerly the director of the group itself, and he has worked extensively on issues of justice and rights in the context of conflict in South Asia. His much acclaimed uh, The Politics of Dialogue, which came out in 2004, was the culmination of this work. His particular research have been on migration and refugee studies, which is central to today's talk, and the theory and practice of dialogue, nationalism, and post-colonial statehood in South Asia, and new regimes of technological restructuring and labor control. He authored a 3-volume study of Indian nationalism titled Whose Asia Is It Anyway? Nation and the Region in South Asia, published in 1996. Then The Marginal Nation, the Trans-Border Migration from Bangladesh to West Bengal in 1999, and a biography of the Indian nation 1947 to 1997, published in 2001. His political writings, published in the form of a 2-volume account, The Materiality of Politics, published in 2007, and it formed the 2-volume account, The Materiality of Politics and the Emergence of the Political Subject, by Sage in 2009, and finally The Nation State in 2012. These have challenged some of the prevailing accounts of the birth of nationalism, signaling a new turn in critical post-colonial thinking. So I would invite Dr. Samadar to speak on the subject, and as far as my understanding goes, he will be speaking on internal migration today that followed immediately after the lockdown in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic that was pan-India. His work on migration, the trans-border migration from Bangladesh to West Bengal, was cross-border across 2 countries. But this time, what has become more important is the internal migration, in the sense that the border has come inside the country, and that has changed the subject of the discourse altogether. This is important because hundreds and thousands of migrant workers started leaving the cities soon after the lockdowns was announced, and in the process they had miseries and fatalities. This is when the borders came alive and inside the country, as I said, and what Dr. Samadar calls the politics of life ensued. I think is the central to his today's presentation. So I invite him to speak for about 30 minutes. And in the meantime, I would request you to keep your audios and videos muted unless they are already done so by the operators. And I would also say this is only for the reason that you can hear him clearly and see him without any disturbance. I request you to keep posting your questions in the chat box, and these would be picked up at the end of his lecture, and maybe a few comments from me. and we will try to accommodate as many as questions for Dr. Samadar to respond depending on the time that would be left. So over to you, Dr. Samadar.
Thank you, Professor Vinod Khagria, and my thanks to the India International Center for inviting me to discuss the question of COVID-19, the what is known as the migrant crisis, and what I have termed as the politics of life, or the new ways in which the question of life uh, is being addressed or is articulated through the crisis. I think what is important in the beginning to touch on a point which my dear friend Vinod mentioned, that while uh, scholars have studied with increasing global attention the transborder flows of forced migration and migration, but what has happened in India and has caught the attention of the media, the state, the local governments, political observers, etc., is the phenomenon of internal migration, which exploded almost on the scene consequent upon the lockdown. I want to begin from that point. I think the the optic of the crisis is important to understand what is the significance that what has been termed as the migrant crisis conveys to us, those who have been working on migration, or for that matter, refugee flows. And while I shall not dwell much on this, but I want to flag the point that usually in the migration studies literature or in the international migration literature, the refugees and the migrants are kept apart as categories. And even though scholars have increasingly recognized and admitted that there is a huge amount and an incredible range of overlap of the migration flows and what is termed as the refugee flows, but today, when you view the migrant crisis in India, in fact, this tells you, in a way, what has happened with perhaps greater or lesser attention internationally. And those who have been engaged lifelong in studies of refugee flows may now see the complications of refugee flows, the life worlds of the refugees, the conflicts that mark the topography of forced migration flows better if they see what has happened in India from late March, early April, and perhaps what continues till today. So, all I want to say is that if you look even at the global compacts on the protection of refugees, and on the other hand, the safe and orderly migration of the migrants, the global governance architecture and the managers of global governance want to keep these two things apart, which is why they had two separate compacts. But in reality, one actually reflects the other, or to use a slightly quasi-philosophical term, one is actually the displaced site of the other. If you are studying refugees, you can understand that phenomenon better if you have seen what has happened to the migrants in India. And on the other hand, if you want to see what is happening in India to the migrants, then a knowledge of what has happened to the migrants all over the world will help you understand better. But why is it so? This is because the COVID-19 crisis is not purely an epidemiological crisis. in a way, we may say that the crisis around COVID 19 is a meeting point of three crises. One is the epidemic, the epidemiological crisis or a public health crisis. Second is an economic crisis, which began much before. And even though apologists of the modern economic management or the current economic management in India would like to say that COVID 19 actually damaged our economy, etc., it's not true. The economic crisis was there, and for the last 1 or 2 years, it had actually accentuated. And then there is a political crisis also, in the sense that there is a huge centralization of powers, and the structure of Indian polity is still trying to cope with this, how to retain federalism, how to retain democracy, how to retain the dialogic nature of Indian polity to the extent that it was, given the kind of centralization in management of the country's affairs. And all the three crises met in what is today termed as the COVID 19 crisis, and what exploded in the form of migrant crisis. And it is important to keep this point of crisis in mind to understand what happened in late March, early April, and in a way continues till today. I think I will spend 1 or 2 minutes more on the political question, uh, in the sense that it should be clear to all who have studied the migrant crisis, given the fact that there has been speculation whether the central government was aware of the dimension of migrant crisis, or did it ever anticipate that such a thing was going to break out. If you read through the depositions of the government before the Supreme Court, you can see that there is an admission that we were not prepared for that. And one is to ask, why is it so? And maybe, again, this is a point I will touch, but because of pressure of time, I cannot go into details. But I want that listeners and viewers uh, discuss that, given the fact that the template of crisis management was basically, or still basically, consists of two acts. One is the Plague Act, what is usually known as the Plague Act of 1897, the Epidemic Diseases Control Act, and the National Disaster Management Act, where the epidemic was interpreted as a disaster and not as a public health crisis, and the huge centralization that is permitted by both the acts, and set the template of epidemic management. uh, the way the migrant crisis exploded on us should not surprise us. In fact, one may ask, what is the relation between, let us say, lockdown, one of the most familiar techniques of epidemic management, and the spread of the disease? Uh, One thing that you have to understand, and if people who have readers who are familiar with Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish, they will recall a chapter in Discipline and Punish where Foucault speaks of the town which was suffering from plague, and how the city mayor or the councillors, the city rulers, how they wanted to control the city precisely through the methods which were adopted this time. And today we have given the term lockdown, and this is a question that was addressed by the governments of the day at that time. Does lockdown really manage or control the spread? And is there a standard formulation of the relation? And one of the things that the migrant crisis showed was that this relation between the lockdown and the spread of the disease is fraught with enormous uncertainties, unpredictable developments, and basically, it's an extremely conflictive, a very contentious field. Now, we all know that migrants, as my dear friend Professor Binod told, that thousands and thousands upon migrants, they returned, they wanted to return. By a conservative estimate, some 300 migrants perished on the road, some on the train, some on platforms, some on rail tracks, some under the speeding trucks, and simply of exhaustion. Now, many theorists of migration have recalled that this should not have been surprising and the government should have taken this into account, uh, because migration is marked by what is known as circular migration. So, migrants returning home should have been known to the economic and the political managers of the country. My only point is that here, that we are missing the political significance of the act of return. At one level, we may say there is no return. I mean, in a slightly Derridian turn of phrase, we may say there is only re-turn, in the sense that the migrant turned and did something which cannot be termed as return. No conventional knowledge of circular migration would tell you why and how, as if ordained by God from the sky, that hundreds and thousands of migrants in a span of 10 days started walking from all corners of India, facing inconceivable hazards to basically reach home. Some people have said, including yours truly, that there is an autonomy of migration, that migrants are autonomous beings, that the act of deciding to migrate is an act which is a declaration of the migrants' autonomy. Others have said, and I think this is also true, that it is the crisis itself at one level that, in a way, told the migrants, it is time to leave. You may die on the road, yet there is nothing for you here and you have to leave. Whether you will be ejected by the landlord, whether summarily you were told that there is no more work, that messages are coming from all around, there will be no one to see you, no one to protect you, and there are all kinds of manifestations of, as I said, the crisis, which was much more than an epidemiological crisis, but a crisis in the faith of the governed on those who govern. The crisis in the confidence of the people, the complete breakdown of trust. And it is trust that has been found again and again the most crucial element in the management of an epidemiological crisis. And the migrants' return showed that the trust is suffering an enormous deficit, to the extent that we could, without hesitation, say that the governance structure collapsed like a house of cards. The other point that is linked, therefore, to return, and to interpret it or to see it with deep policy implications, that it cannot be considered as a return, but it is a new turn, it is a re-turn, is the fact that it is only through the act of return, and not because of the writings of the scholars and academics and policy managers, government people, bureaucrats, international advisors, not through their writings, through their advices, that the country became aware that there is a segment of population that is known as the migrant section. But on the other hand, it is precisely the decision by the migrants, as I say, thousands and upon thousands, all across the country, in a span of 7 to 10 days, we must go back, we must be out on the street, is that decision that made them visible. Therefore, the question, what makes the migrant visible? And what is it that, in a way, makes it almost obligatory that in quote and unquote normal times, the migrant would remain invisible. What ordains this order of visibility and invisibility? And clearly, the fact of invisibility, you may say that should have been known, but again, the fact that the state also admits that the migrants were not visible, that the 1979 Act was good for nothing in terms of knowing the migrants, that the figures of these migrants range from a conservative estimate of 2 crores to as high as 12 crores given by the central trade unions, given the fact that only in the hour of crisis, the moment of crisis makes the migrant visible, tells us a kind of dynamics marking the relation between the political sphere in which the migrant remains invisible and the economic sphere in which the migrant will be visible. What is it that allows something to be visible in economy also compels invisibility of the same phenomenon or the same figure in politics? What is it that makes the figure of the migrant invisible in politics? And again, I am aware of several suggestions that have been given. Some policymakers have said that they should have a portable right to vote. Some have said that if they have a portable rights portfolio, then that would help them, perhaps to some extent. But by and large, I am convinced of the fact that this bifurcation of visibility and invisibility, the bifurcation of politics and economics, will continue. And the fact that the migrants returned, got no work or got very little work, even though we have schemes announced by the prime minister, we have, how would you put it, uh, good gesture by the Congress leader Rahul Gandhi in meeting the migrants, gestures by some of the state governments in expanding the scope of the NREGA. But the fact remains that at the end of the day, in the backdrop of the agrarian scenario, there will not be enough work. But again, you may just conventionally say this is re-return. But again, my caution would be, do not think in terms of a return, because this is how you may say that the motor of what Marx would have called primitive accumulation continues. It is precisely what is called the eminent domain in which the economy continuously gets its leverage, its sustenance, its final force, that functions and that compels the migrant either to go out, take to the roads, or take the roads, come back to the village, and then again to go back and not go back in the same place. In most of the cases, they will again have to venture into unknown areas, unknown occupations, and to the extent that reports are coming out, it will be a new journey. What is also what is also uh, uh, remarkable in the sense that most of the portrayal of the migrants' return has been seen in terms of from the cities, from the urban areas, semi urban areas, back to the village. And very little report has come out on what has happened to urban migration. Urban poverty, if we do not have anything comparable to NREGA when we think of the cities. And even though, as far as West Bengal is concerned, my knowledge is extremely limited, NREGA has been extended to, let us say, tea plantations in the northern part of Bengal, in Darjeeling, in Jalpaiguri, in Kuch Bihar. But in urban areas, the state governments had to do much more in order to prevent hunger deaths, starvation deaths, and enormous destitution, which in any case is happening. I think what the migrant crisis in a way also brings out, and this is my last but one point, and I will stop there, is that the epidemiological crisis cannot be removed from the scene when we talk of the migrant crisis. What is it that it was only in the context of an epidemic that we got to know that there is this figure of the migrant always lurking behind, and at moments of a public health crisis like this, then appears savagely on the scene. This was the same when the plague ravaged in those days called Bombay and Pune. By an historians estimate that 500, 300,000 migrants left the city. We are now conducting a study of the public health structure where we are trying to show that there is nothing called public. Even though at one level, community health and public health are different things, and public health is an idea that is synonymous with the growth of the cities, etc. But the migrant crisis showed that there is no seamless public field. And the public, this quote and unquote public, is fraught with enormous fault lines. And one of the fault lines is characterized by the spread of the migrants. I will end with the question, if this is what the life question is, and in a way I'm trying to say that the migrant question is no longer an economic question, it has become a social question. You could see from reading the newspaper reports, the anxiety of the court, the anxiety of the judiciary at state levels, the anxiety of the bureaucrats, the politicians, that the migrant question has become the question of society. It is no longer a question of people who just go out to some places to earn something and make their families survive. It becomes a question of life, a question of society, because what would happen if they return? Would the disease spread more? So in a way, it also threatened the society because of the disorderly way, because of the unpredictable way in which the crisis burst on our face. I have termed it as biopolitics from below. Now, I know the biopolitics is a term that I am actually drawing from Foucault, but I'm using this term in a different way because the more I studied how migrants were received in their villages, in their hamlets, in the small quarters of the cities, there are reports of migrants who were asked by the families to take shelter in the orchard outside the village for 15 days because they knew that 15 days after that they were safe. There are reports of how they survived those days on treetops, and the village panchayats helped them to survive. There are photographs of migrants perched on boats in the Sundarban area, in the riverine areas of the northeast, the east. And the modes of survival, there are reports of, how would you call it, the vigilance of the slums, who kept the slums more or less free from infection. And you could see that as the crisis management proceeded, just as the center said, states, you have to now help, and it devolved on the states, who now were fighters on the front. Similarly, the states were depending on districts, districts were depending on villages, Anchal Panchayats, and all that, where you could see that it was the response from below that was actually helping the migrant to survive in unpredictable ways. There are innumerable stories of migrants who just said, yes, we do not want to endanger our family, our villages. We will go out and find other avenues of work. All I'm saying, therefore, that even though clearly we need major structural reforms in our public health architecture, and strange that we are giving importance more to education than to life's question, which is the question of health, but it is a fact that a more dialogic structure, a structure that allows much more conversation between the migrants and other sectors of economy, between state and the center, between districts, between shanty settlements. We all know of how Dharavi was rescued, at least for the time being. We all know how Kerala was managed. We all know how food security was enormously guaranteed by various state governments, including Bengal, even though that admitted of certain amount of corruption. The fact is that there is a new pattern of politics of survival which can be found at below. And it is there that we have to find out the more effective ways of managing the epidemiological crisis. Thank you, and over to Professor Binod.
Thank you, Ranabir. That was very, very comprehensive. You started from the broad picture of the whole nation and then narrowed it down all the way to villages and towns and districts with particular examples in West Bengal and Sundarbans and so on that you have mentioned. I would invite our audience to start putting in their questions in the chat box, so that we can take them up eventually. In the meantime, I would like to have some conversation with Ranavir in terms of some of the issues that he has highlighted. And what comes to mind when he talks about some of the states um, playing their role and federalism being, put under question, even though the smaller entities, starting from districts, blocks, villages, and so on, had been playing a very proactive role in handling the crisis, the pandemic crisis at least. Uh, what kind of, has there been a good practice example somewhere? Because other day I heard the Delhi government trying to cooperate with the central government, because otherwise they belong to two different parties. But when it came to COVID, I think there was an appeal from the state government in Delhi, uh, clearly, putting it on the table to say this is not the time to fight against each other. Even if our paths are different, this is a time to come together and save the nation. And this is where the state government acknowledged that the central government did cooperate. So that is one example, or I should say, is it a ray of hope, or is it just transitory, something which would not last for long? What are your views on this issue, and whether we can emulate this? Whether it is not only center and the state; it can be state and another state, because what I see that during the first 10 days that you mentioned, when the crisis was at its peak, the states were also behaving like nation states. They were behaving like sovereign countries in terms of shutting down their borders, not allowing these people to cross the borders. And then came the regime of seeking a pass. If you are going back home, you need to have a pass from the district collector, and so on. So that is where I think the states were playing that role, but down below, the districts and the blocks and the villages, it didn't trickle down in terms of authority being given to them that you would expect in a federal structure, or even to panchayats. Panchayat Raj we talked about. Well, what role has the panchayat to play in this, and health being a state subject in the constitution? I think this is an issue that you probably can share your views.
Should I respond now?
Yes, we'll have some conversation by the time I
You
will
see,
see how many
when I
questions we get, and you may respond. We can have a conversation.
when I spoke of the practices of the state, the best practices, I did not have the center in mind or the center state cooperation. But I had basically three, four models in mind. If you use the term model, one is the
Yes,
Kerala one. And even though there will be a return of infection and the management will always be uncertain given the fact that we do not have vaccine, etc. But the fact that Kerala managed it in the way without invoking some of the draconian things shows that there is a much more dialogic way of managing the public health crisis and enriching the notion of public health in unforeseen ways. Of course, one of the interesting things about Kerala was that Kerala, apart from the fact that it had much more money at its disposal than many other states, but also enriched with the or backed by its own experiences of flood management, where again it took care of the migrants and things that the migrants are guest workers, where for Kerala's economy, the migrant is an absolute essential. So that explains in many ways that Kerala is a migrant receiving state, though it also sends out migrants to the Gulf. But if you think of India, then you will see that geographically, the eastern part, some of the central part, and the northeastern part have turned out to be migrant sending state or the region. And from Jammu and the valley, Haryana, Punjab, bit of Rajasthan, but much more Gujarat, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Kerala, and certainly to some extent Tamil Nadu. These are migrant receiving states. And this is how actually Indian neoliberal development is taking place. Whether you think of construction work or modern cultivation, we can go into that. But the fact is that certain states are dependent on receiving the migrants, and certain states are surviving by sending out migrants. One of the interesting thing is that this crisis forced the states to recognize that they are our migrants. And you could see that one of the results of the migrant crisis was that states had to now recognize we shall take them back, etc., because they are our people. And this was political pressure, electoral calculation, everything. But if you think of model, I think interesting is the Dharavi model, where Greater Mumbai Corporation, how it managed it temporarily. And it's not easy. Exactly like the Kerala model, the Dharavi model is equally important. Again, if you see how Bengal, to some extent Bihar, Orissa certainly, they have managed to avoid a food crisis, starvation deaths to a large extent. And again, we have to give credit to the state governments, how they ensured the right to food and the food security. On the other hand, not all cities are as fortunate as Delhi. Not all cities will have the good fortune of having the Union Home Minister taking a personal interest in saving the city. Good that Delhi has been saved. We all hope that it will be saved. But at the same time, we have to also see that there is an unequal, or let us say, the unequal kind of scenario in this. I think what is more important is that when what I'm trying to suggest, that the institutional map tells you of certain ways in which dialogue took place or dialogue can take place in terms of a more dialogic dialogic uh, possibilities of the epidemic management. But I think what is more important is the non-institutional ways, the unforeseen ways. And that is why I mentioned the grassroots experiences that have been brought out by by newspaper reports, amateur anthropologists, intrepid citizen journalists, in social media, in different kinds of reportages, which tell us that different ways of managing the migrant crisis, different ways of tackling the epidemic uh, have been have appeared. And it is important to see those voices. There have been migrant solidarity forums that have emerged all over the country. A friend of mine who teaches at Chandigarh, Mohali, has actually created a map which is called the Map of Migrant Resistance, which shows several spots on the map. And as you draw your cursor there, you can see the sources from which he prepares the map. And he shows what he terms as a kind of a emergence of a militant philanthropic spirit all over India. While the established trade unions in some ways failed, this is 2020, 100 years of All India Trade Union Congress, the AITUC. But given that the old ways of political mobilization were not possible, the established structures failed, even in terms of organizing solidarity. Whereas unorganized forms or new forms, unanticipated forms, they emerged all over India. So my plea is to give them proper recognition, study them much more, and find out what are the different and newer forms of epidemic management, and the ways in which the question of life is being articulated. I will end with the remark that neoliberalism has redefined the question of life. The life is now being re-articulated through politics of insurance, the politics of risk, the economics of insurance, and the different ways in which the privatization of healthcare has happened. The economics of life, is now articulated in different ways. One knows of Great Britain, one knows of Spain outside Madrid, where the old age homes became the graveyards of the old people, where the caretakers or the caregivers ran away and the old people died after the epidemic struck them. And these experiences are not even 2 months old. On the other hand, the way migrant crisis has rearticulated the question of life at the grassroots level, I think leads us to ask, what is the new politics of life that is being articulated at the lower levels?
Excellent. I think you have mentioned about the private sector and the health insurance and all those agencies that brings to mind the role that initially the private sector hospitals were trying to make short-term profits by charging people exorbitant fees, exorbitant rates of costs for testing and hospitalization for beds and so on. So I think when you talk about politics of life, it is also the politics of livelihood which is coming in the way, because their argument was that they also have to survive. And I think there were conflicts of interest there, and it was very difficult to address those, whereas the government hospitals were not equipped enough with the instruments that were necessary. So where do we go from here? I mean, what lessons do we draw from this for the future in terms of what should be in the purview of the health policy, which covers these hospitals and other entities?
I will take a slightly different, I will have a slightly different take on that. If you look at the, let us say, the Bhore Committee report, an old report on public health, as I said, the independent India had from the anti-colonial time, because of malaria, because of the Spanish flu, so the epidemic where 1/6 of Indian population was wiped out in 1918, 1920, the memory of the plague and all that. So independent India took as its first task of eradicating malaria. And Nehru had this vision of a public health, public research, health, medical research institute, etc., etc. On one hand, you can see that this public is with all its merits, is a very bourgeoisified notion of public, where the public does not acknowledge that there is no seamless public, that like the migrant, or like the distant village, or like areas inhabited by the Dalits and other marginal sections, that the public is composed of several unequal segments, and as I said, it is fraught with fault lines. So even though you build up public hospitals and you build up certain good hospitals, etc., etc., you have primary healthcare centers and you may have many other things, but at one level, the defect is that the public is not a seamless public. So you have to remodulate public health structure in a way that the public health structure takes into cognizance and therefore restructures itself partially to accommodate, as I said, the unequal segments of society. But at the same time, you know that if you take London or England, the best known public health structure in the world, the National Health Service failed miserably in the present crisis. Why? Because if you see the reforms in the National Health Service that took place from Tony Blair's time, public health, no, National Health Service units were turned into trusts who could operate privately. And so therefore, and they could
Mm,
say that your supply of ventilators, your supply of beds, your supply of oxygen units, your supply of your protective gear, all these, even 3 years ago, were considered as non-essential and non-permanent items that you could dispose with and you can later on procure them, given that market would be playing an important function in being a partner of public health. So I will stop there on this thing by saying that merely saying that public health has to be augmented or has to be strengthened will not be enough. Public health structure has to be revised in many ways that takes into account the, as I said, the life's question. Disease and epidemic makes health the fundamental question of life. It is life that has to be saved. And world economy has enough resources. India has enough resources to make its people, to allow its people to live without jobs for 6 months, and they can have proper food. Economists have said that they could have 5,000 to 10,000 rupees per month for 6 months. So I do not think it's a conflict between economy and life, or job and health is a something that is being bandied around, that is being placed on us as if it's a choice between the two. I think it's a false choice. I do not think that world economy is at such a stage where we were thinking of universal basic income, and now suddenly with 2 months or 3 months of crisis, we are saying, oh, how do we re-energize the economy? It's one of those rules. But I think the other important question is that neoliberal economy, if you see, and allow me little bit of in one or two lines of theoretical observation, neoliberal economy is marked by the return of the question of trust and the question of insurance. Because the idea is that you provide health by providing insurance. On the other hand, the Almaty Declaration was health for all by
Yes.
2020. So that was a different vision where socialists had taken over the question of public health exactly, and Labour had tried to deepen the idea of national health service, and still known by one of the best public health services in the world. People have emulated. Socialist countries have also said that they had to learn. Or think of Lenin after 1919, when we know that typhus was destroying millions of lives in Russia. He said, either the lice or socialism. Two cannot survive together. And that's why I said that if you look through the optic of insurance, then obviously privatization would become the way out, where the insurance industry, the manufacturers of ventilators, to all kinds of things, to the way in which the race for the vaccine is going on, you can see that it is capital, and it is capital, and it is capital that will be dictating the way the epidemic management will go on. The challenge would be, how do we rescue the public health sector and not make public health sector the only resort of the poor people, who will then in a time of epidemic will say, oh, the government hospital is only our only way of saving our lives, and the private hospitals will keep on reaping dividends, and we will say, let us invest more in public health. That cannot go on. The two cannot survive together.
Okay, Professor Ranavir, I think I can move on to the questions that have come from the audience now. And if at the end there is any time left, then I can pick up threads from what you shared just now. But there is an important question which was at the back of my mind, that in terms of what lessons we have learned, that is very, very relevant, and it is being asked, do we have an accurate database on how many migrants from which locations are working where? I think this is an important, because our data on internal migrants is dependent on census, and the census takes place once in 10 years. So whatever data we have now of 139 million internal migrants who at the time of enumeration were not at the place of birth, is completely outdated. And of course, I mean, not to speak about their skill profile and their educational profile and so on. So that is something that we need to have some kind of a mechanism to count our migrant population intra-census. That is something that I would like you to address, but I would like to club some other questions along with this, which also is that was support to returning migrants hampered by insufficient financial support from the center, or in West Bengal, for example? That is, I think, something very, very important in terms of whether there can be innovative methods of putting liquid money into the hands of the victims. I am reminded of, you mentioned United Kingdom, and I'm reminded, of course, I am reminded of how they circumvent the ethical recruitment policies. The NHS, recruits from the private sector, the nurses that are coming from Africa or Pacific, South Pacific, recruited by the private sector hospitals. But that's besides the point. What is important is right now, even UK, distributing food through the restaurants by 3 days a week, making them, charge only 50%, and the remaining 50% would be subsidy given by the government. So these are some of the innovations that perhaps in terms of good practice guidelines, whether we can borrow from other countries. And at the same time, there are also bad practice guidelines. I call them bad practice guidelines that needs to be phased out. And the current example otherwise is from Canada, which is doing very well in terms of treating the migrants and asylum seekers and refugees, not to turn them away like the United States is doing. But at the same time, when it comes to international students, they are not extending the concession in terms of charging overseas fees that they are doing for their home students. So I think there are issues that you perhaps might like to address these 2, 3 questions before I turn to others.
I think on the question of database, uh, it's a paradoxical situation, and the paradox is revealing. Uh, if you see census, first of all, these census figures finally came out by 2018, 17, 18, 19. So as you point out, that by the time the figure comes out, it is already outdated. You have certain limited figures from the NSS, and there
NSS.
may be others. But I think what is interesting, and to my mind, we had an article, in fact, in the book that I edited, and which came out very early as the crisis broke out in April, called "Borders of an Epidemic," where we, asked the question of the figures. And as I said, that it is in the nature of the things that migrant has to remain invisible. Now, I do not think that the priority should be to enumerate them in order to attend to their problems. I think the priority should be attend to their problems, and in the process, you will be able to enumerate them. In other words, if you make it, and which is one of the reasons why the 1979 Act failed, and even the court didn't give enough cognizance of that act, the highest court of the land, because if you say, and if you do it mind of obligatory for private employers and the states, if you devise, let us say, hypothetically, a scheme where one third is given by the state, one third by the center, and one third by the employer, then you have, as soon as you have the migrants arriving, then you know that either you have what you may call a fund for the migrant worker to access health services, to access dispensaries, to access pharmacies, etc., etc., or you guarantee them other securities of life, and that is how you start enumerating them. So that is the other way around, because I have resisted the idea all through my research life that it is the problem of numbers. That it is, if we know numbers, then we can solve the problems. I think examples are all around. First of all, the limit to our knowledge of the numbers, it's like saying how many illegal traffickers or how many illegal trafficked women are there in the world. We
Yes,
are
yes,
discussing a liminal, a sub-legal phenomenon, particularly given the fact, let's take Delhi, where hundreds of Muslim migrant workers, women are working, they are all Hindu women, because so that's how they can get jobs as domestic help.
yes,
There
yes,
are hundreds of workers from Bengal, again, of other faiths, minority faiths, who have been discriminated against, lynched, killed in Gujarat, in Rajasthan, in Madhya Pradesh. There are stories and stories of discrimination which compel the migrant to remain at a sublegal level. If you force them to continuously say where you came from and you compel documentation, you may actually end up losing the very objective with which you had started. So my idea would be, I mean, this is a very limited thing, suggestion. It doesn't solve the problem, but I think apart from the importance of NSS or other specially designated surveys, I think what is important is to again begin from below. Because as you know, Nirmala Sitaraman said, we don't have enough figures, and we quoted these figures before the court because We took the help of the state governments, the NGOs, the district authorities, etc., etc., and that is how we came up with the figures. Even though it's a kind of an admission, omni-blind, if you may say, but it also tells you the way in which you can get an idea of the figure. But it is not lack of figures that led to the crisis. It is the crisis that tells us that figure is something probably we should know of. Second is support to the returning migrants, innovative methods. I already told that, in fact, we need young anthropologists, young, people who study philanthropy, people who study this enormous surge of humanitarian feelings, but which is not a feeling of piety, which is not a feeling of pity, which is not a feeling of kindness, but which is a feeling of solidarity. There is a marked difference between these ethical concepts, and that's why I use the phrase militant philanthropy. I can tell of, we are now engaged in a work of building up a migrant solidarity framework. One of the things when we started was we were struck by the range of the attempts made from Karnataka to the Northeast, where different groups came up, groups which had never dabbled in politics, which were not professionally run NGOs, which were not parties, different parties, trade union arms. They were there. But at the same time, it was a kind of a surge of militant philanthropic spirit. So I will suggest, as an answer, what can be more innovative than this? As I asked, what can be more innovative than finding out how villages have coped with the returning migrants? What can be more innovative than finding out, besides what Vinodji has said, that how states obstructed, how states in many ways facilitated also, except states like Gujarat and few cases others, where in Surat there were cases of police firing, beating, gowling, and all that, muzzling the voices of the migrants. But
Yes. Ranabir, we are close to time, and I would like to
okay,
flag
so I
these
think I will stop there.
other
Yeah.
questions. There are a few other important questions also, which you may like to address, and they are all in the same category of questions. But before I pose the question, I just share my thought on what NGOs are doing. I think we have a philanthropy. We have an exemplary example of the langars that the Sikh community had put up, and including some NRIs, were funding this from abroad to pay for the food that was being distributed through the langars. And these numbers which were fed were not in hundreds or thousands, but were running into lakhs. Having said that, let me just pose this question. One question, which is that while announcing the lockdown, could the government have announced certain measures to prevent the return migration? If so, what the measures are possible? And the counter question to that are two more questions are: migrant workers have again and again said, we are going home. For them, home means their villages. Is this feeling on their part an asset to build an efficient future on? And the third one is, can we not try to think of policies which will make migration in such scale from villages to overcrowded cities unnecessary, so that circular migration does not take place, which is almost unmanageable? So I think we have just 2 minutes left, and if
Okay.
you can, share your thoughts on these.
So on the last thing, the policies, very clearly, I mean, you can have expanding the NREGA, other asset formation, but there is a limit to that. But I think again on policies, I am on the whole sure that given the nature of Indian economy, and as I mentioned the phrase primitive accumulation, in the way construction sector and all that are growing, it
In fact,
is
somebody has asked this question about Manrega for urban areas, whether, you had also said this in your talk. So I have just tried to put that in right now.
it's an important thing, and I think it is necessary to revise. And Professor Binod, you'd have to pardon me for saying so, because I do not want to trespass into other areas, but it is necessary to think of economics or economy in a non-economics way. In other words, we always disparage the so-called populists of having no economic sense, that they overspend. that they have other skewed sense of priority. But given the way in which they enable people to survive, they give new life or inject new life to agrarian
Yes.
economy, given the way they in fact help these small scale and medium enterprises to regain their scale and their productive activities, my only point is that if we have to think of urban economy where the migrants would have a great role to play, whether as a returnee, then it is clear that one were to ask, if the cities of India need migrants, and I hardly know of any city which does not need the migrant, what is it that cannot enable the states to have its own migrants do the work in their own cities that they require the migrants from outside for? So there is something in the economy in its present form which needs the migrants in the way they come. So I will stop there, save only to say that we have to think of economy in a much more, how would I put it, from the question of the options of life, from the question in the way life can be seen. It is a very social Darwinist world. It's a neo Malthusian world. We have to accept that
Yes.
those only who are productive will be employed. That's why I raised the question of eminent domain. How does the state ordinance the question of labor? And similarly, it's a question of social Darwinism. We have to understand that the epidemic works in a way where a chunk of human population, a slice of human population, whether they are old, as we say, they're suffering from comorbidity, or they are migrants, they will be sliced off from the productive part of the economy. That takes you beyond economics, so I don't go into that. I leave to this to Binoti. The other two
Thank
things.
you, Ranavir. We are
Okay,
already over time, but
okay,
it is
okay.
always
Thank
healthy
you.
to leave with questions unanswered,
Sure.
than to leave people with questions that may or may not be acceptable. I am glad that you have mentioned that, and it reminds me many of the first lessons of economics that had learned as an undergraduate student. For example, pump priming. What is the role of the pump priming, and what is the role of the unproductive population? As you said, I don't think unproductive population has no role. It has definitely a very matching role in terms of boosting the economy. That I think we have to cross the borders of the disciplines, and we have to think in multidisciplinary terms that you have always done, and I have always learned this from my teachers also. So thank you very much for your sharing your thoughts. We hope that we will have more occasions. In the meantime, I must mention that Dr. Ranabir Samadar has put together very quickly two online compilations of works. One he already mentioned, Burdens of an Epidemic, which actually followed Borders of an Epidemic. These are available online from the Calcutta Research Group, and these, I think, have been contributed by journalists, social scientists, activists, legal practitioners, thinkers, and so on. So thank you very much, and goodbye. We will see you again at the next occasion.
Thank you.